I'm a school principal and have been for 10 years in a Deshband 1 senior school in Tallaght in Dublin. Before being appointed principal, I was ICT coordinator in the same school for about 7 years. And it's that experience I'm going to talk about, as well as up to 20 years experience working on course delivery, course design with schools, school staffs throughout Ireland. But another well I'm going to draw on is the fact that in my own school, I'd say on average about once every 3 weeks, we welcome a delegation from another school who have come to us to try and find out what works well for us, and we're happy to do that. But many of the issues I'm going to touch on now actually arise from those conversations that people bring to me in terms of the advice and the information and the suggestions they're looking for. I was very, very impressed by what I saw from Clontuskert National School, and for 4 young pupils to travel so far and to be so coherent and articulate and knowledgeable is a huge credit to them and to their school and to their teacher. And I'd like to reiterate the well-dones that you've already received. Unfortunately, it's a great pity that that school is not typical. In fact, it's probably unique is a more accurate term. And I would say, in my experience, that the percentage of schools operating at such a level in this country is well below 10%. Now, I have my own ideas as to why that is the case, and I will present them to you in the next half an hour or so, and maybe some suggestions as to how, as a country, we can manage to come up with more and more schools operating at such a wonderful level of using technology. Anytime I'm asked to give a presentation, I have 3 guiding principles. The first one is a nice cup of coffee and a chocolate biscuit, and that was provided. The secondly, as I've already alluded to, is I will only speak about what I know. My own experience is what you'll hear. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I think. You may not agree with everything I say, but that's fine. Education is not a very exact science. And thirdly, I always start any presentation I give with pupils. So I'm going to roll a little over 5 minutes of video taken in my own school, none of which was organised for this event. Some of it goes back a couple of years. And I'll make a few comments about those clips and then I'll go into my presentation. So I'm going to start with practice and go from practice to theory, just to mix it up a little bit. So if we're ready to roll, please. That clip was a 4th class, and what they're doing actually, they're singing an Irish song, but they're Skyping with another school in Dublin who are also singing to them. One of the massive advantages that technology brings to a school is the increased audience for what children have to say, to sing, to write, and to produce. Okay.
The poem is about leaves falling from the trees.
Okay. Runo kertoi siitä, miten lennettiin puusta.
Okay, the first clip you saw was a music and an Irish lesson. This one is actually a geography lesson. This fourth class are video conferencing with a school in Finland, in central Finland, in a city called Oulu. And the idea here was that our pupils would teach the children in Finland a little bit of Irish, and in turn the pupils in Finland would teach our pupils a little bit of Finnish. It's a geography lesson because that is the Trojan horse way of introducing climate, latitude, longitude, how people live and adapt in different cultures, different climates. Okay?
You're welcome.
I haven't touched the sound. Obviously here the children are working individually. It's a sixth class after Easter, and they're using a Nintendo DS. The application they're using is called More Brain Training. I spent about 5 minutes in the class that day. That was the actual sound level, and I think about at least 50% of the children didn't even know I was there. Okay. That's the Nintendo DS again. I'm not sure whether it's brain training in 5th class or more brain training in 6th class. It's just a little example of the type of activity that the children are involved in. Clearly there's a little bit of calculation to be done, but it's calculation with an edge, because not only do you have to add on the number, you have to remember the number that was erased 2 seconds before you get to do it, under pressure of time. So we go on to the next clip, please. That's the final clip of the Nintendo DS. This time, obviously, the children are working in groups of 3. Okay, mixed ability groups, and they're using an application called Professor Layton and the Curious Village, which is one of a series of 4 adventure-type mystery games. What the children are actually doing there is they're reading, they're talking, they're listening, they're working collaboratively, and they're solving problems together. Okay. Fifth class using tablets in 2s, again working collaboratively in an adventure game simulation type scenario. Okay. Okay, once again, that was a different 5th class sitting in the computer room, working in pairs, together, collaborating on doing a little bit of research for a project they were involved in. The next one I'll show you now while the opening shot is there. It's the 3rd class. And again, it's in the other computer room. They're, again, working in pairs. And they're learning about dogs, the dog family. And one of the things I like about this clip is the level of noise and chat and conversation that's going on. I've long believed that the silent classroom that you can pass by and there isn't a sound to be heard, that's the class I'm worried about. The class where there's a babble and a chat going on, I think there's learning going on there, providing the teacher's in there, of course. Okay, please. Okay, we can go to the next one, please. That's the final clip, a different 3rd class, and they're doing, again, a little bit of research, starting a project on wild animals that at a later stage will be presented by the pupils, either printed out and displayed or via PowerPoint. I'd like to make a couple of general points about those clips. And the first one is, I think it's quite obvious, the level of engagement. Whether you're a teacher or not, you can see and you will know that if you're engaged in something, if you're interested, well then learning is possible. I think it's quite obvious there how the technology draws in the children. The function of the teacher really is to just channel that enthusiasm and that interest so that learning ensues. Secondly, you saw, I think, most subjects on the curriculum there. There was music, there was Irish, there was English, there was maths, there was science, there was geography. In some of the lessons, you had 3 or 4 of those subjects actually together and can't be separated. You probably won't have noticed, at least I hope you won't, that in each of those classes that you saw, there will have been children on the autistic spectrum. There will have been children with ADHD. Children with social and emotional behavioural difficulties, and children from a diversity of backgrounds. The technology has hidden that and engaged them all, working with their learning style and their way and at their level. A huge benefit of technology being deployed in the primary classroom. You will have seen desktops, laptops, tablets, interactive whiteboards, and Nintendo DSs. And it's a case of horses for courses. There's no such thing, I have found, as the perfect device. Tablets have their strengths and they have their drawbacks. The same with desktops, the same with any technology you like. The key is to know what you want the children to be doing and then use the appropriate piece of technology. In my view and in my experience, one of the main difficulties we've had over the last 20 years in this country is we've started with the technology. Say, okay, here's the computer, here's the tablet, here's the interactive whiteboard. Now what will I do with it? And in my view, that is the wrong place to start. The right place to start is by asking, what learning outcomes do I want to achieve? What do I want the children to learn? What do I want the children to do? How do I want the children to learn what I want them to learn? And then the next stage is, what piece of technology can help me achieve that goal? In my experience, when you start with that question, you are far more likely to be successful than if you start with the other question, because you're likely to go anywhere. Final general point about the video clips there was, you were probably wondering, do we have any teachers in my school? Because you couldn't see them. But there was a teacher in every class. But it's an indication of how the role of the teacher changes. No longer the sage on the stage. Now the guide on the side, the organizer, the supporter, the helper, the driver, if you like. I think more and more teachers are now accepting that this is an effective way for children to learn. They're losing their fear of handing over the control and being more prepared to step into the shadows. Just because you're teaching doesn't mean that anybody is learning anything. I think the focus in all those videos was the learning, not the teacher. At this point, if the lads are ready, I'd like to go on. Yes, you're ahead of me. Okay, so now I'll go on to the theory, if you like. So we'll just start with this, and it's self-explanatory. I think in the top picture, the focal point in that classroom is the teacher, even though you can't actually see the teacher. Everybody is looking to the teacher. In the bottom colourful picture, again, there's no teacher, and everything seems a little bit more disorganised and haphazard. But I wonder, in which of those classrooms is the most appropriate learning taking place in terms of developing the ability of those pupils to live in a society in 20 years' time or in 10 years' time, which we cannot even begin to describe. Because even in the last 10 years, these are just some of the changes that have come into education. And it's only when you stop and think and look back, you suddenly realize, my God, 10 years ago, I wasn't using any of these things. And now, for most of us, they're second nature. And we wonder, how did we ever get on without them? And the rate that things are changing is accelerating. Again, it's very clear from this slide, it took 40 years for the radio to reach 50 million users globally. It took YouTube 1 year. And this is the challenge, and it has been alluded to by every speaker here already today. The challenge we have, the conundrum educators have. How do we manage and work our schools to effectively educate our pupils to take their place in a world which is changing so quickly? Here's one view of education, and I wonder how many teachers still subscribe to it. I can't answer that question. A decreasing number, I hope. And here's an alternative version described by Pasi Sahlberg, who is well known as a Finnish authority on their education system. And the quote is from a Nokia executive. And I'll make, I think, at this point, a couple of comments about the Finnish education system, which is held up there as one for all of us to copy and to try and emulate. I spent a week there in February of this year, and it was a most interesting week because some of the characteristics of the Finnish education system would be there's no inspectorate, there's no standardized tests. The Finnish teachers are the teachers least likely to be worrying about PISA results. Doesn't bother them in the slightest. Education in Finland is seen as a national priority. And as a consequence, massive efforts are made to attract, maintain, and support the highest caliber of people into the profession. Teachers are seen as doing the most important work in the world and are far more highly respected than they are in this country. The final point I'd make about it is that one thing that was very clear to me in Finland was there exists a very, very clear vision as to what the expected outcomes of education are. They're very clear on that. And consequently, they have a very, very clear vision of how the technology in primary education is used. One flows directly from the other. I believe in this country, we haven't been too sure what the technology was for. The Finns are very clear about that. And I would suggest that one of the reasons the pupils from this Galway school are unique is because around the country, in schools and staff rooms, everywhere, there isn't the same clarity of vision as to what kind of outcomes we want our education system to produce, and in turn, what is the actual role of the technology we bring into our classrooms. One American commentator, Rosen, argues that how children learn today differs substantially from how children learned 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that if schools can't keep up with that, if schools fail to reflect the nature of society that children live in, what happens is that pupils become disengaged. Prensky, another American commentator, says more or less the same thing. When the policymakers think that we have a good education system if we score well in PISA, and that's the most important indicator of how well we are doing. We are failing to prepare our children for the future. We're okay for the past and the present, but the future is where the worry is. One of the reasons, again, I suggest, as one of our speakers said earlier, why there may well be a jobs mismatch in this country at the moment is that we have failed to prepare the generation of 5 and 10 years ago for today's society. I believe in Ireland at the moment there's between 3,000 and 4,000 unfilled jobs in the technology sector. But yet, every month you have the same amount of people going to Dublin Airport, leaving the country to get work in other countries. There's something radically wrong when that's happening. Another issue I think that has come to my mind increasingly in the last few years has been the fact that now there's much more potential for pupils to learn when they go home. Now, I don't mean homework. There was a time when whatever positive learning took place happened within the school gates between 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Now, with the technology that exists in homes, schools have a much greater opportunity to influence how that technology is used at home. In my own school, for instance, we use 2 subscription-based applications which are online. The vast majority of children have access to them. Mathletics and Reading Express. The school pays the annual fee. The children are encouraged by teachers and parents to continue on their work at home, and they're rewarded for that in school. Also, most children, and I'm sure you four are no exception, have a Nintendo DS. In our survey that we did in my school, we found that over 95% of children had a Nintendo DS at home. Most children spend most of their time with their DS playing games, which we could describe as trivial games. But there are some wonderful, educationally valuable games, such as some of the ones I've mentioned, like Brain Training, More Brain Training, the Professor Layton series, and many more, which parents can use at home to support their children's learning. Having a school website and making recommendations to parents as to other good websites the children can visit are also effective ways of trying to increase the amount of learning that's happening in children's lives beyond the school gate. Prensky, again, making, I suppose, the same argument that if teachers continue to teach as they were taught themselves, we are not doing our pupils any favours because we are not preparing them for the workplace of the present, never mind the future. We heard earlier that the amount of knowledge in the world doubles every 2 years. Well, if that is the case, surely our schools and our teachers have to make every effort to keep abreast of the changes that are taking place. Otherwise, we as a country, I suggest, will lose our competitive advantage against other countries like Finland, who have seen the light and who are ploughing ahead and paying less and less attention to PISA scores and standardized test scores. We heard a lovely phrase earlier from Greg Butler, a relevance conundrum, where schools are struggling to make classrooms and corridors as relevant and authentic to children's lives as they could be. I would suggest in this country we also have an assessment conundrum, because the skills of being a lifelong learner, the skills of complex problem solving and interpersonal communication are not skills that are easily assessed. But are we brave enough as a profession to actually teach those skills? Or maybe teach those skills is not the best phrase. Create opportunities where those skills can be learnt and developed when it's difficult to assess them, and where the Department of Education wants standardised test scores to be sent to them every June. I suppose that really sums it up. And again, I think a very fundamental question teachers and principals and policymakers have to ask is this one. So again, it's the relevance conundrum, it's the assessment conundrum. And I would suggest it actually comes back to a very, very fundamental vision conundrum. What precisely is our vision of how our primary education system should look like? And what are the outcomes we would like to achieve in our schools? Until we, as a society, think about that and define and articulate a response to it, we will continue to be all over the place with how technology is used. And schools like Clontuskert will continue to be unique rather than typical. A very good book I'm reading at the moment, Why Do I Need a Teacher When I've Got Google? It's very interesting, and it relates to the previous question. And again, at the risk of repeating what Mr. Butler and Miss Butler have said earlier, it's not the information you have in your head that matters, it's what you do with it. And I love this quotation from Piaget, who I still remember from my days in college many years ago. Intelligence is what you use when you don't know what to do. It's the best definition of intelligence I've ever heard. And if you accept that, I suggest that teachers must organise and structure opportunities for pupils to engage in activities that are meaningful to the children, that are relevant and authentic to the children, that are open-ended in nature. There's not necessarily a right answer, that involve collaboration, problem solving and creativity. I actually think the video clip I showed you earlier of the pupils working in trees on Professor Layton and the Curious Village actually demonstrates that type of activity very well. There's 100 more things you can do. The project on ring forts, perfect example, a perfect example. Now I'm going to flick through these just about the whole horses for courses thing. Why do we have particular technologies? And you'll notice a lot of emphasis on collaborative learning. We have 2 computer rooms in our school. In both of them, it's 1 computer between 2 pupils. We have a set of tablets, and there's 1 between 2 or 3. We have a laptop trolley as well. Now, depending on what they're doing, if children are typing up something, it's better that they work on their own. Otherwise, one person is doing something and the other isn't. And we all know the devil finds work for. So the guiding principles in my own school, and I have about 7 or 8 minutes left. First of all, we do not view technology as a subject. It's a cross-curricular resource to be used at the teacher's discretion to enhance teaching, to enhance learning. We don't teach ICT skills formally. We don't have typing classes or PowerPoint classes or Word classes. When a child needs to do something that's relevant to the activity, they're shown, either by their teacher or by another child. Any hardware we have, the choice of that is predicated on what it's going to be used for. That's our starting point. And I often advise schools who come and ask, well, what's the best tablet, or what's the best laptop, or what's the best interactive whiteboard? I suggest to them maybe a different question would help them come to that answer. And that is, what are the needs of my school? Is problem solving an issue? Is spellings and tables an issue? Is, do you want to have more collaboration between pupils? Do you want to have more project work? What are you trying to achieve? And then you match the hardware to that objective. And then, as I said, greater thought is given to the applications that will be used on the technology than on the type of technology or the brand of technology, particularly ones that are relevant to the needs of the school you're in. Applications that encourage engagement and active learning. And in all the video clips I started with, it was active learning that you saw. No teacher-directed learning. Collaborative learning, and going back to what I said about learning at home as well as in school, cloud-based learning activities are, in my view, highly recommended. And as I said, I've named two, Mathletics and Reading Express. These are the questions I have been asked most over the last 10 years. And if I had €1 for every time I was asked, I certainly wouldn't be here today, braving the wind and the rain and the gales and all that. What interactive whiteboard should I buy? Which tablet is the best? Should we have a computer, and which platform is the best? These are the questions that teachers continually ask. But I would suggest they're the wrong questions. The first question is, what are the needs of the pupils? What are we trying to achieve as a school? And even more fundamental than that, do we subscribe to Mortimer's definition of what education and intelligence are about, or Piaget's and Prensky's and Rosen's and Butler's and Hallisey's and so on? The next question then is, how can the technology help us as a school enhance the achievement of those objectives? Following on from that, what are the most appropriate applications for this to happen? Some may well be content-rich, some will be content-free. And finally, what hardware now do I need to buy? I just had a look at the programme for government. The government's ambition is to build a knowledge society, and that education is key to that. It also says we will draw from top-performing education models like Finland to do this. So there's an interesting question. Is that what we're doing? Or are we doing the opposite? Because if we do the opposite, it will have the opposite effect. We will never achieve a knowledge society, I suggest, until we overcome these obstacles. These are the obstacles that mean Clontuskert remains unique and not typical. We need to ask ourselves, what is the technology in our schools for? What type of teaching and learning do we want to enhance and develop? Remembering or thinking? Answering questions or solving problems? Working individually or working collaboratively? And if we're to do that, we have to have funding. Without funding, we cannot plan. I've been to schools in most European countries, and one thing I've noticed in other countries is that school principals know how much money they have to spend for the next 3 to 5 years on technology. They can then put a plan in place. In my school at the moment, we are struggling to pay the cleaners and the electricity bill and the insurance. And at least 1/3 of primary schools in this country are in the very same boat. So if we have ideals of creating a knowledgeable society and being as good as Finland, we're not going to do it by cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. It's not going to happen. A major issue that schools are having is unreliable broadband, and that's a fact. How can we expect to build a knowledge society if the broadband doesn't work if it's raining, or the wind is coming from the northwest, or whatever the case may be? That is the case. 2 more points. Many schools are really struggling to keep their computers going because there is no plan that schools can buy into to keep the technology working. If it doesn't work, it's forgotten about, and we go back to the way we used to do things. Finally, one result of the effects of the recession has been a moratorium on in-school management. So basically, unless you're going to be a principal or a deputy principal, there's no promotion. And I know that many of the posts that have been lost are ICT coordinator positions. The principal can't do everything. And while we have a situation in our schools where there are a decreasing number of ICT coordinators, teachers with responsibility for driving ICT usage forward, we can forget about a knowledge economy. So it's a pity to finish on a kind of a negative note, but I've been honest, and I do think that is the reality of the situation. Once again, I would like to applaud these wonderful children from Galway, but I have to be realistic in making the point that they're unique and not typical.